Don't you hate that feeling when you're so excited to talk to someone about a film, to share your experiences and nudge each other's elbows while gushing about your favourite scenes? And that's when they tell you, oh, I haven't seen it. This video is a little bit about that. Everyone has a different definition about what underrated means. It can mean that barely anyone knows about it, that the general consensus is less than what it should be. And it's funny because I've chosen a handful of films that I consider underrated, but I'm not sure how they'd fit into that general definition. This wasn't a matter of promoting unknown films. Some of these works come from great directors. I'm sure that a good portion of these films many people have at least heard of before. And in regards to perception, I don't particularly think that any of these films are considered bad at all. In fact, most of them, if not all of them, have good reputations in the eyes of the people that have seen them. But I chose these films and I consider them underrated for a few reasons. Yes, they aren't the most popular films of all time, but their inclusion is more akin to the status I believe they should have. To me, these are films that for some reason have been forgotten or avoided of the high status that they truly achieve. I think that some of these films have been overlooked in cinema's canon, as I think that most of them are in a caliber in regards to genre or movements that few can hardly reach. And it also gives me an opportunity to discuss films that I haven't had and rarely get the opportunity to speak about on this channel. Before we start, I'd like to quickly mention that if you enjoy what we make and would like to support us, please consider joining our Patreon. We're reimagining our platforms to make them more accessible and rewarding. By joining our $3.99 tier, you get access to our Discord community, downloadable resources, our podcast Acid is Bad for Business, and over 20 episodes of The Deep Dive. And the higher tiers have access to additional perks, like the book club and workshops. By joining, you help us stay 100% fan-funded, allowing us to continue creating thoughtful content free from any corporate influence. I'd like to also quickly mention that 2025 is shaping up to be a very exciting year for us, with bigger projects, collaborations, and special events all incoming. And if you join one of our tiers now, you'll be a part of all of these developments. New members that join can get 50% off their first month until the end of November by using code SCREAMPASS. So take advantage of this promotion and help keep this project alive. Go to patreon.com/cinemacartography. Thanks and enjoy the video. A Town Called Panic. Imagine making a film where you use the same narrative structure as a child that throws their collection of mismatched figurines around a room, smashing all of their toys together, and giving them a terrible excuse for a character arc. Well, that's exactly the kind of story that takes place in A Town Called Panic.
Il est peut-être perdu. Ça va, tu ne vois rien? Eh oh les gars, vous êtes cons!
A Town Called Panic is pure unfiltered chaos, and is nothing more than an experiment of creativity for how to make every working piece of a film into the most absurdly ridiculous scenario one could imagine. Sometimes when introducing a film on videos such as these, I discuss the plot. However, to even use that term here, I would simply be using a placeholder, when I really should be describing it as a collection of things that occur in front of us. The film follows cowboy, Indian, and horse. It starts on Horse's birthday, where he's receiving a barbecue. Then we end up underwater, they battle scientists and a rogue mammoth, and Horse continues to practice piano at his music school, where his romantic interest is.
Je vous écoute.
Et voilà.
There's nothing that should be described about this film because it goes against any convention of traditional storytelling and instead bombards us with surreal humour, a frenetic action, characters screaming instead of speaking. It's just limitless imagination, and it's all brilliant. Perhaps there is some layer of depth to the film, maybe, but I can't see it as anything less than entertainment. But this isn't a slight on the film at all. If anything, simply by leaning into its pointlessness, does it become a better film? It's not trying to be anything more than what it is, but that doesn't matter, because what it is already surpasses any of its contemporaries. The handmade animation balances the crude with something refreshingly unique, similar to how works like Robot Chicken and South Park are enhanced by their unrefined styles. It's supposed to look jerky and off-kilter. Every movement is exaggerated, but it manages to know exactly what gesture and position will make each scene all the more funnier. There are times when things are created that are supposed to look bad, and they struggle to replicate why those things carry such a charm. A Town Called Panic is no such endeavour. The filmmakers know exactly what makes something funny, whether it's a pose, a scenario, or even just a funny voice, and they're able to do this across the entirety of the film's runtime. From gluing a destroyed town together brick by brick, to chasing off scuba divers by hurling pigs at them. This is what happens when you try to create the most ridiculous idea for a film you possibly could. I wouldn't be surprised if they threw a bunch of random words at a wall and just decided on the plot from that. But this is a kind of filmmaking that the world needs more of. Just that childlike approach where we don't care about logic and we relish in the unpredictable. Just use the simplest materials you can muster and create the most chaotic vision you could ever imagine. Apocalypto. Mel Gibson's Apocalypto is a breathtaking achievement and a kind that we rarely see in modern day cinema, particularly when thinking of the scale and ambition associated with mainstream releases. A film about human resilience and the fragilities of even the greatest civilizations, Apocalypto is a traditional hero's journey set in the framework of a historical epic. Following a tribe living in the jungle, we get an unfiltered look into their primitive and simultaneously idyllic life, until they're taken as slaves by the greater Mayan civilization. When I watch Apocalypto, I can't help but think of how nowadays, even great directors with strong track records such as Robert Eggers aren't even allowed by studios to have their films in any other language than English, even when based in other countries. But along comes Apocalypto, setting its story in centuries-old Mayan culture and crafting the dialogue in Yucatec Maya. With set design and costumes of such immense spectacle, Gibson transports the audience to experience the visceral immediacy of a culture on the brink of transformation, with an authenticity in both its depiction and its brutality that's rare to see. I'm always one to support the grand ambition of artists, and Apocalypto is just such a treat when it comes to this. Gibson eschews the limitations of modernity and allows this world to live and breathe as it needs to, pulling no punches in its depictions of tradition as well as its depictions of violence. Apocalypto is a viciously violent film, and the storytelling is on a level that's raw and elemental. The textures of the jungle, the blood of men, the power of nature, these are all tied to the fabric of Apocalypto and serve as the beating heart of this beast in which men slaughter one another to become the apex predator. a small, simple tribe is facing annihilation from the larger, more civilized sect of Mayan culture. We see people enslaving their own, ritual sacrifices, and the instinctive urge for survival embodied in humanity, just as it inhabits the animals of a jungle that becomes central to the landscape of the film. The entire film is fantastic, I love it, but the second half ramps up the tension of what's an already engrossing story, because the second half of the film is essentially just a chase. In the film's climax, our protagonist Jaguar Paw, who's been seen as nothing more than a slave by his captors, finally returns to the jungle, his domain, and challenges them to fight him in his home. It's powerful as we're plunged into the jungle and watch the power of nature take its course, and our main character undergoes this transformation where he returns to his status of a powerful vessel of this mythical terrain. I wish I could do justice to the intensity and urgency that this film carries. Captives resist their enslavement and have to fight to the death to retain their freedom for almost the entire film, and in turn, Apocalypto walks this path, wherein both heroism and barbarism reside. Everything about this film is great. It's a primal kind of storytelling which few studios would be willing to back, and it was done with a level of ambition that's rare to find amongst major releases. There is, I think, a level of controversy behind the film, simply because of Gibson and his history of being a controversial figure. However, if we just isolate this work, he delivers a sensorial assault about life, death, and the history of humanity's worst and greatest aspects. It's a great action adventure, and one that should be more recognised for just how great it is. "3:10 to Yuma." 3:10 to Yuma by Delmer Davies is a western, but it's so much more than that. Now, people would typically use a statement such as this to denigrate or downplay the impact of something that would restrict itself to nothing more than a genre piece. But I don't share this sentiment. I think that genre pieces are incredibly undervalued. So when I say that 3:10 to Yuma is more than a western, it's because it can't be contained within the conventions of a single genre.
Why didn't you say Grace? Because he's bad?
I simply forgot it, dear.
Aren't you supposed to say Grace with bad people?
Grace is for everybody, dear.
Well, then why don't you say it?
Whereas westerns are typically denoted by their sweeping vistas and views of nature, 3:10 is a far more intimate tale, and it manages to tell it in a simple yet electrifying story. Ben Wade is a captured outlaw who must serve justice for the crimes he's committed, but while in custody, his gang are attempting to free him. By nothing more than fortuitous circumstance, a man that's been pushed to the brink of desperation with his family must escort Wade and outrun those on their way to free him. And he has one goal that will determine the success of this endeavour, and that is to take Wade to a train station and board the 3:10 to Yuma. The screenplay is simple. It has no excess or filler, which means that as you're watching the film, you're completely invested in the unfolding drama up until the last second. And the tension that ensues throughout, I can only compare to a very Hitchcockian piece of cinema. You have the element of the ticking clock, but then there's also these very dramatic uses of the cinematic language and a crescendoing narrative that serves as an incredibly memorable and unique watching experience. What's amazing about 3:10 to Yuma is that it's not just that I'm incredibly invested in the story, even if it were simply a MacGuffin, but it's not. The two main characters that we spend almost the entirety of the film with are so vivid and rich that it adds these constantly deepening layers to this already densely packed story.
I didn't think you'd shoot.
You know I will the next time.
Ben Wade carries the temptations of any man that's willing to let his shadow rule him, yet what he really wants is offered by ambiguous suggestions by the film. Perhaps he respects the family man. Perhaps he wants to wipe out all that he doesn't have. Meanwhile, our protagonist is searching for some grand meaning to his existence and is willing to be a sacrificial lamb as long as it grants some purpose to his life. The film's quite short, and a large portion of it takes place in a hotel, so the story is completely saturated with meaning and emotion. There isn't a moment where you aren't involved, and the interplay between the two main characters is this morally charged battle of loyalties, of power, of what being a real man is.
I bet she was a real beautiful girl before she met you.
I told you before to shut up. You say just one more word and I'll cut you down right now.
No, you won't.
All I have to do is tell him you tried to get away. You hear me?
I hear you.
You believe me?
Our anti-hero is one of charisma and unpredictability, whereas our hero is one of struggle and sacrifice, and watching the dueling forces at play belongs in any great thriller. The film uses its hotel space as a claustrophobic pressure cooker, where every action that occurs within its walls is loaded with tension. Meanwhile, on the outside, we feel the encroaching threat as the clock ticks closer and closer to 3:10. And every second that passes feels as though a precious second lost, and the inevitable realization that time does not possess a moral code. The film has everything: the allure of man's shadow, the heroism of individuals, and the romanticism of man journeying through the harsh landscapes of nature. By the time the train arrives, 3:10 to Yuma has transformed into something more than a western. It's a character study and a thriller. It's a western and a personal drama. And by its final sequence, we sit with it as it settles within our minds, not with the adrenaline of a shootout, but with the quiet reverberation of moral choices made in impossible circumstances.
I mean, I don't go around just shooting people down. I mean, that isn't nice, you know. I work quiet. Like you.
Ace in the Hole. Billy Wilder has made many masterpieces in his time, but none are more overlooked than his 1951 satire, Ace in the Hole. Now, if you've seen the episode of The Simpsons, where Bart plays Timmy O'Toole, the boy who gets trapped down a well, then you've seen a small parody of the story. Ace in the Hole follows Kirk Douglas, who after being fired from several newspaper publications, finds himself in New Mexico, working for a very small firm as a journalist. Upon looking for a story, he finds that in a nearby cave, a local miner is trapped under rocks inside. Douglas ventures deep into the cave to find the man and report on his story. However, the story becomes public interest, and before long, it becomes a nationwide phenomenon. And in order to reap the benefits from this once-in-a-lifetime scoop, it works to Douglas's benefit to create more drama, and ultimately, keep the man trapped in the cave.
I don't need 18 days. If I just had 1 week of this... Oh, brother. You're kidding, Chuck. You don't really wish for anything like that. I'm not wishing for anything. I don't make things happen. All I do is write about them.
Ace in the Hole is a scathing indictment of media sensationalism and human greed, and it's as sharply written a film as you could expect from Billy Wilder. Wilder has such an interesting career because of its versatility. He was well known for his ability as a comedic writer, but this was often only because of the dark wit that permeated so much of his work. He was as equally as well known a filmmaker of the noir genre, and he excelled so much in it because he clearly possessed a deep understanding of the shadow of mankind. And it's that understanding on display here, particularly on Chuck Tatum, the film's major focus.
When you have a big human interest story, you've got to give it a big human interest ending. When you get people steamed up like this, don't ever make suckers out of them. I don't want to hand them a dead man.
Chuck weaponizes charisma, and through it inadvertently creates a collective hysteria. People becoming personally invested in the story because of how popular it's become, because it's gaining a celebrity-like status. Wilder uses Tatum's relentless manipulation to expose the public's voyeuristic appetite for spectacle, the crowd growing larger and larger until it literally becomes a human circus.
This is the 5th night the big drill has been pounding and grinding its way toward Leo. The rescue workers are now only 26 feet away. At the rate they are going, they should reach Leo by this time tomorrow night. So after 129 hours of being buried alive, at last freedom seems in sight.
The film is mercilessly critical of any and all engagement with this kind of perverse behaviour in regards to humanity, where the reigning constant is a lack of empathy, as the film reflects the cynical tone of Tatum himself. The entirety of Tatum as a character reveals the seductive allure of selfish ambition. To what degree do we regard something as exploitative? What responsibility is held by audiences and consumers of stories about real-life suffering? And from a filmmaking perspective, the reason I believe this to be the most underappreciated of Wilder's works is because of its proficiency as a film. The pacing is relentless. As the scale of this event grows so out of hand, the moralities of people become warped. What was once an insignificant spot on the map of the United States has all of a sudden become a swamp of immorality. The mise-en-scène becomes grander, as heavy machinery accentuates the soundscape, with crowds clamouring to get a brief glimpse of the fabled man. The entire backdrop of the desert becomes a wave of opportunistic chaos, underscoring how easily tragedy can become entertainment.
Did you get your man out, Mr. Kuzak?
I'm afraid we didn't. We were too late.
Well, then, suppose we let Mr. Smollett do it his way, from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Tatum. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Smollett. I know I speak for my entire radio audience when I express my great admiration for both of you.
Ace in the Hole came right at the peak of Wilder's noir era, and yet it serves more as a prophetic warning about the intersection of fame, influence, profit, and corruption. It's a bold and unflinching take on what happens to the human spirit in an age dominated by media sensationalism, a haunting reminder of the moral cost of spectacle in a world willing to look the other way.
I guess everybody's got a lot of friends they don't even know about. Like those guys drilling for me. Or like you, Chuck. I didn't even know you were alive this time last week. And now you're my friend. I guess you're my best friend.
You Were Never Really Here. Lynne Ramsay's You Were Never Really Here is a hauntingly visceral exploration of trauma, violence, and redemption. A film that operates as both a brutal thriller and a meditative character study, as we follow the fractured psyche of Joe, played by Joaquin Phoenix, a hitman who carries the weight of the world and wears it on his beaten and broken down body. His violent past follows him everywhere as it manifests itself in his seemingly binary actions of brutal violence and silent suffering. Joe is a disturbed character, and yet he's one that we seem to deeply understand, one whose past spectres forever haunt his psyche. You Were Never Really Here is a violent film. After being hired by a politician to retrieve his kidnapped daughter, Joe stumbles upon a human trafficking network, in which he stoically proceeds to enact violent revenge upon. The film is a savage tale of redemption, from the perspective of someone that can only seem to embody brutality. The world has been cruel to Joe, and he to it. And so, as an extension of his barbarism, a hammer is his choice of weapon, as he aims to compel this world into repentance by crushing it under his brute force. The weapon an extension of Joe's own self-loathing and an indicator of the kind of violence present in this film, difficult to shy away from. Though like much of Ramsay's work, she carries a transcendent eye. Her films are more akin to the work of Terrence Malick or Ingmar Bergman, her gaze resting on silent moments, or the otherworldly elements present alongside these harsh material truths. In turn, You Were Never Really Here transforms into a revenge tale that focuses primarily on something far more intangible and introspective. If brutality is one's truth, and yet one also possesses some deep yearning for love and belonging, how can a character like Joe exist in this world?
You can go wherever you want. Where do you want to go?
I don't know.
No, either.
Everything about the film is unsettling. Ramsay's ability to translate the absolute rage regarding the destruction of an innocent child, the fury permeates every frame. Scenes where the audio is neither diegetic nor outside of the world of the film, its distortions and choices to remain enigmatic in all elements of the filmmaking serve to only fuel that fury in us, the viewers. We don't get to see everything, we don't get to hear everything, and yet we're desperate to. We're clinging on for some great catharsis to take over and cleanse us of this hideous world that we're embarking upon. Johnny Greenwood's score is a masterpiece of discordant sounds and fragile melodies, echoing Joe's fragmented mental state. His inner turmoil is not only captured within the film, it's echoed within the audience. We're plunged sensorially into the very same plight. Ramsay refuses to provide easy answers in You Were Never Really Here, a film where, more than any other, we hope for them. Joe's hulking frame lurches through the film as deep shadows overtake any hope that light may emerge from them. But what Ramsay crafts is a mesmerising glance into the soul of a man at war with himself, and perhaps the soul of all men that find themselves in a world they need to destroy. And we're left to wrestle that we exist in a world where so much of what we see repulses us, yet there's so much we haven't seen which we may dare not to. After Hours. Martin Scorsese's After Hours is a feverish odyssey through the surreal nightmare of New York City's nocturnal underbelly, a dark comedy thriller that captures the suffocating absurdity of a single, seemingly endless night. The film follows Paul, a word processor whose mundane life takes a bizarre turn over the course of one night in Soho. Made in 1985, After Hours was the starkest turn for Scorsese's career up to that point, and it remains the least Scorsese work of his filmography.
Christ. Not another one.
What? Another what?
Guy lives in the same building as me. He's been by here 3 times already tonight to tell me about 3 separate burglaries in this neighborhood, all tonight.
What?
What?
What begins as a casual encounter spirals into an unpredictable series of misadventures involving eccentric strangers, escalating misunderstandings, and a city that seems to conspire against our character at every conceivable instance. Whereas the films of Scorsese often focus on epic narratives of individuals and the alluring gaze of the hypermasculine, After Hours was a film that Scorsese made to reignite his love for the act of filmmaking, to have a project which thrives in unbridled creativity, wherein the artist unleashes themselves from their self-imposed restrictions of style and convention, and just make something that they want to for the sake of making it. The main character of Paul is trapped in a limbo, where nothing is going right for him. And in turn, each scene becomes this tripped-out experience of utter chaos, in which Paul finds himself attempting to navigate so he may escape from these weird, alienating forces that emerge. The simplest, most reasonable requests from him rapidly degenerate into these free falls of overreactions from people who, out of the blue, became a threat for no reason.
I can get free copies whenever I want to.
Gee whiz.
Hey, what is that? Gee whiz. I mean, are you humoring me? I don't have to take that kind of shit, you know? I mean, what is it with people today? You can't say anything without getting some kind of a smart answer. You just have to be so goddamn careful about everything you say.
The closest comparison Scorsese has in After Hours with his other work is The King of Comedy. It's still a very funny film, but with that dark vein that Scorsese can't help but focus on. A world that is completely indifferent, how the very nature of people plunges into these strange purgatory landscapes. As Paul spirals further and further into these lands of uncertainty, the city of New York transforms along with it.
I'll probably get blamed for that.
Scorsese's typifying fast pacing only enhances the hostile maze of neon-soaked streets that Paul maneuvers through, one that we know he's so incapable of doing after seeing the sterility of what he is in the daytime. After Hours is Scorsese at his most playful. It's a film populated by strange characters, the likes of which you may see in Pee-wee's Playhouse. It's about the misadventures of a man going through seemingly infinite bizarre encounters, and the experience is as simple as that. The camera's always moving, because our main character is trapped in a relentless cycle of fleeing from an unknown predator, only to be dragged further into this surreal labyrinth. It's an uneasy and anxiety-inducing watch, but it's filled with so much wit and joy that it should be more remembered as a successful departure from one of the medium's masters.
What do you want me to do? Where do you live? Can you take me home? Because there's certain things that I will not do. I'm telling you in advance.
Living in Oblivion. If you want to get a good idea of how difficult it can be to collaborate on any ambitious creative endeavour, then watch Living in Oblivion. Following Steve Buscemi as a director who's creating a low-budget indie film, Living in Oblivion is a great glimpse into the frustrating, unfocused, and often hopeless endeavours of every wannabe artist. Those who bite off more than they can chew, those with egos that overwhelm any of their talents, and those who, quite frankly, are just unlucky.
Then he started hitting Danny.
Ellen,
Cut! Okay, that's okay.
Living in Oblivion is a masterclass in meta-cinema that is a film about making a film, and it carries a self-awareness of its ludicrous material, and it perfectly captures those relentless pursuits that we all often engage in environments where every disaster possible occurs and only continues to escalate. The film takes course in a single day on set, where different scenes involving relationships between the cast, dream sequences, all invariably become tied into the real-life events behind the scenes. Where the fiction ends and the reality begins, starts to skewer the insecurities and the irritations of every crew member. But the shining gem of the film is Steve Buscemi, who delivers a pitch-perfect performance as Nick Reeve, a man who's so tired of everyone's shit, of ineptitude, of people not taking his ambitions seriously, and he's just barely holding it together.
God, sit no food on sick. Where are you? Can somebody help me, please? Huh?
He's so intently determined about getting this film made, and yet is so isolated that no one else can see the idiocy of everything that's occurring around him. The crew is comprised entirely of archetypes, which remains a testament to the absurdity of these environments, that the film remains an exaggerated yet at the same time very telling depiction of the realities of independent art. Over its 3-act structure, Living in Oblivion descends to a deeper and deeper level of dysfunction. And although its observations about the filmmaking world are critical, cynical, and almost hopeless, the film still operates as a love letter to the kind of messiness that exudes from this very specific brand of guerrilla artistic endeavours.
All right, cut!
The artistic creation is its own kind of battlefield, but it becomes a wasteland as soon as you get other people involved. It was one thing to navigate the tenuous thread of your own disposition, but now you have to maneuver around everyone else's. Creating art is equal parts mundane and chaos, and Living in Oblivion captures it to a T. Beneath its satire lies a profound respect for the act of making something meaningful against impossible odds. It's a celebration of the imperfect, and a reminder that this is what lies at the heart of every creation: suffering, being undervalued, having to interact with other people. But in the end, it's still worth it.
I've loved you from the moment we met.
Why didn't you tell me?
We were working together. I didn't want anything to interfere. God!
Cut!
An Elephant Sitting Still. This is a different kind of film, and one that's difficult to put into context. Hugh Bowes' An Elephant Sitting Still was his first feature film. It would also be his last, as almost immediately after finishing the film, Hugh Bowe took his own life, and one can't help but view this film as a suicide note in the form of an art piece. An Elephant Sitting Still is an elegy of a world where insurmountable suffering is what paints the hue of its eternally grey image. We follow 4 characters over the film's 4-hour runtime, as their lives intersect in a small industrial town. And while their existential endeavours are occurring, we hear mumblings of an elephant that's located somewhere, sitting perfectly still and unmoving, completely indifferent to the suffering of the world. And perhaps at some point they'll find it, and it will mean something. The film is bleak and hard to watch, as the questions it raises feel so crucial to the very nature of humanity. What are we supposed to do with our lives when we know that this is it? How does one overcome the existential crises that's innate to modern living? Hardship here occurs through unique circumstances, often fortuitously. There is no cause and effect, nothing that we can ground ourselves within reason. Life just is. And with that, do we so often find ourselves lost? The film is long, and you really feel its length perpetuated by the emptiness of our protagonists' lives. We're not watching a film of narrative, we're watching human emotion paint this canvas. Filmed in long, unbroken takes, the reality we find ourselves in is stifling. Our characters suffocated by their inescapable existences. They're surrounded endlessly by a muted, desaturated palette. The sky is forever overcast, and every frame of the film feels weighed down by the utter stagnation of this world. Nothing moves, and yet the people still dream. Perhaps they still hope. One story follows a young child who has to deal with a bully at school. Another story follows an old man who must leave his house to live in a nursing home. This film really is a conversation with the spirit of people, of you and I. And it speaks to us in places we really don't want to speak, because we know these certain truths and sometimes they're just too difficult to deal with.
那我就不知道了。
他偷了。
我没有。
在超市门口拿着购物卡8折优惠，收了钱就去网吧。
我没有。
你除了去网吧，你还会干啥？狗东西。
An elephant sitting still is a requiem. It's a cinematic cry for something, and yet has no answers. Perhaps the cry emanates from the fact that we don't even know what it is we're crying against. Hugh Bow follows his characters with an intimacy, and every gesture of the film feels monumental. Every whisper feels as though it's a secret shared directly with you. The film is harrowing, even more so when it becomes almost inseparable from the filmmaker's tragic ending. This immersive dive into the soul of a human being at their endpoint is something that can't quite be described. It's even difficult to summarize what this piece means in the grand story of art, but what it does do is linger with you. It leaves you with this bittersweet sensation as the hum of industrialization echoes through towns. The weather never gets better, and the distance between you and your peers grows larger and larger. Perhaps there still is something else out there, some brief oasis of serenity where one can find themselves sitting with their own contentment that life goes on.
你们还要去哪？
你他妈就烂死在这儿。